George Floyd, Daunte Wright, Andrew Brown, Eric Gardner, Philando Castile, and Michael Brown. These are all unarmed Black men who died in the hands of white police officers. Their deaths have led to global protests, newly sponsored federal legislation, heated debates about police excessive use of force, and books that focus on the experiences of Black men in America. Today, we are talking to two brilliant Black male authors about their best-selling books and the state of Black men in America. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
My first guest is Mateo Askaripour. He is a New York Times best-selling author of the highly acclaimed book, Black Buck. So welcome, Mateo. So glad to have you here this morning. So, I did a lot of research on this book, and I read one critic said it was one of the best books in the month of January when it came out. This is your first book. So how did it feel to get such incredible reviews for the book?
Man, every day I feel grateful, right? As many authors would, I had high hopes for my book. No real expectations because I didn't want to put that pressure on myself or on the world. But I couldn't be happier with the reception of the book.
Even Jenna Bush Hager on the Today Show is promoting the book and says it's like a part of her book club. I'm sure you didn't see that coming, did you?
No, I didn't know I didn't know that it was going to be picked for any book clubs. And then, of course, the Today Show's book club, Read with Jenna, picked it. And that was cool because that wasn't the exact demographic that I had in mind as I was writing the book. So, and her book group and book club is diverse. It has a wide range of people, but it's been very cool to have a wide variety of people read the book and give me their responses.
So let's step back before we dive into Black Buck. I want my audience to know a little about you because you're not like your traditional writer. You are like a corporate guy, or you were a corporate guy. So tell us a little about your background and what got you to this point of writing this incredible book.
Definitely. So I worked at a startup for around 4 years, and I first started as an intern, and then from there became the community manager. And then, as any company would, or as a lot of startups think that they should, the CEO wanted to monetize. So he tapped me to start the sales team with him when I was about 22, just turned 22, and I had no idea what I was doing. There was marbles in my mouth. I was shook. But fortunately, it worked out. It clicked. And a couple years later, the company went from around 20 to 230. The sales team went from me to 90, and I was 24 managing 30 of them, making like six figures. It was wild. So flash forward, 2016, I become disillusioned with the world of sales and startups. The mission of the organization is no longer in line with my life's purpose or what I believe it is. So I turned to writing as an outlet. And then from there, I started writing fiction. One manuscript, didn't go anywhere. Two manuscripts, didn't go anywhere. And I said, you know what, screw it. Screw pandering to this industry and trying to get an agent or a book deal. I'm going to write this for the people I want to serve in the way that I want. Unfortunately, it worked out.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said that because a lot of authors think that first book, it's coming from the heart, the soul, they pour everything into it. And then, if it doesn't land and it doesn't become instantly successful, they give up. They're like,
yeah, you're done.
I tried it, I'm done. Yeah. But you hung in there, and the third time was a charm. Tell us, the inspiration for the book, I know was your experience at that startup tech firm that you worked at, but I also hear that Stephen King has inspired you. How did Stephen inspire your writing?
Yeah, so the idea of the book came about from, again, me hitting what I would describe as creative rock bottom and me wanting to examine topics and themes very close to my life, but that I felt I wasn't competent enough to discuss yet, especially on the page: race, startups, and sales. It was November 2017, and I was reading On Writing by Stephen King, which, for those who have never read it, it's part memoir, part craft book. So discussing the craft of writing itself. And he said two things that really resonated, a lot of things, but two main things. And one was the way that I write all of my books is I just come up with these scenarios and then figure out how to get my characters out of them or not over the course of a couple hundred pages. I said, okay, I can come up with some scenarios. And two, he said, the best way to become a better writer is to write more and to read more. So I said, okay, I can definitely begin reading more. And not only that, I'll take it a step further and start consuming more art than I ever had before, going to plays, going to readings in New York City, films, documentaries, just trying to absorb as much as I could in order to get inspiration and hone my own voice. And then Black Buck was born out of that. And there was also freedom in making it through that creative rock bottom where, again, I felt as though I could speak directly to the people I wanted to resonate with, while also, hoping that anyone would read the book and find value in it. And again, it worked out, and I'm smiling because there's definitely another world where I'm working on my 8th book at my parents' house.
Wow. Okay. So you're a millennial, right?
Yeah.
So you keep talking about this demographic or these folks that you were targeting when you were writing the book. So who did you have in mind? Who's going to be the ideal person that would walk into a bookstore or go online to Amazon and buy your book? Who were you speaking to?
Black people. For sure. Oh, those are the people I had in mind when I was initially writing it, but especially anyone who has ever been the only one or one of the few in one of these environments. Not always the workplace, as you know, right? Could be a sports team, religious organization, what have you. So those were the first individuals that I had in mind while writing the book. And fortunately, the way that I describe success today, or the way that I define it, is when I get a message from someone who says, you don't know me, but my life was reflected back to me in the pages of your book, and I feel empowered and less alone because of it. On the other hand, there could be someone who's not Black and say, listen, I'm a 65-year-old white Jewish woman, and I don't know what it's like to be Darren, but I do know what it's like to be the only woman on an executive team, so I could relate to that. And your book also illuminated things for me to help me become a better ally beyond, just being performative. So that's what I define success today.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So you got a Black person saying, hey, I was there. I was the only one. And a 65-year-old white woman saying, I've been the only one, not necessarily because of my race, but because of my gender. She, too, can appreciate the character Darren. We're going to dive into Darren in a minute, but I got a couple of other questions I want to ask you. So you were a little reluctant, though, to write about race. Was that because of your upbringing or because of what's going on in the world? Why were you hesitant about the concept of race?
No, I wasn't hesitant about race itself, but I just felt like I wasn't good enough at writing yet to be able to articulate it on the page in the way that I wanted to. My first 2 manuscripts definitely dealt with race and being an other in certain environments. Those 2 books were the training ground. They were my, masters in fine arts, if you will. And then fortunately with Black Buck, I just knew who I was writing for and why I was even writing to begin with.
Okay. So you just felt like you needed to do a little bit more self-discovery before you could really tackle such a big topic. Okay, so let's get right into Darren. Okay, so this book about, race, is about corporate America, it's about, building a sales team, it's about ambition and drive. I mean, there's so many incredible lessons and wisdom in this book. And, I don't know, you may not even be 30 years old, but you got a lot of gems. So, you're dropping a lot of knowledge in this book. So tell us, who was your inspiration for Darren, the main character in the book? Are you Darren? Are you a composite? Is Darren a composite of you?
Yeah, that's the question. So I'm not Darren, even though we have some similarities, but yeah, we're definitely 2 distinct people, but there is some overlap in terms of our journeys. I lived down the street for at least a year where the book takes place in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. Where the office is set is actually the same building where I worked in. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, even though it's not the company that I work for. It's a completely different one, right? But with Darren, I was thinking about my own journey and making his journey relatable to, again, going back to, a lot of people have been in those types of scenarios, while also making him relatable to anyone who has ambition or has quote unquote unfulfilled potential, but has their homies and their family saying, you could be more, you should be more. And then chasing that American version of success and sometimes meeting disastrous and devastating consequences, such as I did in my own life. But, and not to give away too much, and I hope that folks read it, he does find his way back and tries to redeem himself and live for those beyond him.
So one thing I I found interesting about Darren, again, the main character is, he wasn't just about trying to be successful himself once he got this tremendous opportunity, and he gets this tremendous opportunity in the book, but he wanted to do something really big. He wanted to transform this entire industry, this really impenetrable industry in some ways for, Black folks. So, why did you make Darren in some ways like a superhero? This guy that had this bigger than life, vision to help so many other people.
Yeah, it's funny because some people describe him as an anti-hero. He didn't wake up one day and say, let me help all these people, let me liberate them. He had to have it pushed upon him when he was in what we would now call the sunken place. But he realizes, based off of what he learned from his mother and those who loved him unconditionally, that success doesn't mean all that much unless you can help other people achieve it. And that's just a direct parallel to my own beliefs in my own life. So that's why he takes it upon himself to say, I have this knowledge that can help people get ahead in this world in general, through sales and through learning how to advocate for themselves better. But what I sometimes tell people is that the book is incomplete. The idea isn't that a bunch of Black and brown folk just start working for white people and line their pockets, right? Sometimes you get in and you learn what you can, and then you get out. Sometimes you stay and just, attain some wealth for yourself and your community. And sometimes you go around it, right, and start something for us, by us. So there is no one way, but that's just the focus of the book.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me too is Darren experiences a lot of humiliation.
Oh yeah,
in his book, and he even changes his name. Why was that important to the story?
Yeah, so. And I feel like you're not a stranger to this. Sometimes in these organizations, you just start getting nicknames, right? And the nicknames could be random, or they could be someone shortens your name, or and you're like, I don't know if I really like that, but it sticks. The name change, there's levels to it, but at its core is it's showing you that Darren had to leave who he was and the best parts of himself, excuse me, and that which made him different in order to succeed in this environment at someone where he was the only Black person. And then we see him resisting, but then accepting and embracing this new identity, and then changing again after that. So that's what it was symbolizing, the ways that so many of us have to change in order to not just survive, but thrive in these types of environments.
So when you're writing this book, were you acutely aware of things like code switching and, politics of respectability? Were those, terms and concepts that you were familiar with? And were you trying to speak directly to some of those concepts?
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. And it's not like I was always like, okay, this is where he code switches. This is where, and there's a part in the book where he says, I had to know whether I wanted to be Jesse Jackson or Flavor Flav, right? So it comments on, respectability, politics, and the terms that we have to define these things. But for me, I was just thinking back on my life and my own experiences and the experiences of my mother, my brothers, and so many people that I know who we have these discussions. And I took that and I put it into the book. And fortunately, it's worked in reflecting people's lives back to themselves.
Yeah. So again, we're not going to give away the whole plot of the book, but Darren is a salesperson in this company. And a lot of what you're doing is talking about race and racial stereotypes. And so the salesperson, let's talk about your, how you go in on this concept of what and who traditionally in this company, in this country, are salespeople.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So for me, when it came to the aspect of sales and startups, I had to do no research. I lived that myself. And growing up, I watched like Boiler Room, Wall Street, Glengarry Glen Ross, later on Wolf of Wall Street, and so forth, right? You think of Gordon Gekko, Jordan Belfort, Alec Baldwin, Vin Diesel, right? And these are the people who I believe most people think of when you think of a salesperson.
Right.
And who I believe represents a salesperson is in some ways directly indicative of who we believe, generates and receives opportunities in this country. So I wanted to subvert that through having someone who had sales in their DNA and in their blood just as much as any of these other people, but he's Black, right? And just him being Black isn't the only thing that's subversive. That would be too easy. But he has to lose himself in order to find, and then he finds out that who he was before and who he is his superpower.
Yeah, and it's not just upending the whole notion of salespeople only being white, but it's also, thinking of them in a broad sense, women,
Yep.
folks in the LGBT community, and folks, again, who don't fit the traditional, image when you think of these successful salespeople that are in these blockbuster movies. So, Mateo, I read a lot of reviews about the book, and I know that some people consider the book a satire, but you've kind of pushed back on that characterization. Tell us why that kind of rubs you the wrong way.
Yeah, so I see it for what it is, right? That's just how some people market it, and things need to be packaged in the right way for people to consume it. So it doesn't really I don't get upset about it. I understand it, but the book is not just one thing. There are satirical elements, there are absurd elements, but I wrote this from a place of deep sincerity. And I found through sometimes reading reviews or just speaking with so many people is that absurdity or satire is in the eye of the beholder. Right. It really depends on who you're talking to, because there have been people who read this book and say, I don't really see anything absurd about it. I've seen these types of things. I've experienced these types of things. So I've sometimes pushed back because I believe that people put it in a bucket as if all of this is a farce, or all of it is made up. Okay. It's not.
Okay. So you don't want people the takeaway to be that these are, extreme situations or examples that never happen or couldn't happen.
Exactly.
It's real that this stuff happens on a regular.
Yeah. And people can take away whatever they want from it. But when I have the opportunity, like now, when someone asks me, then I'm going to share my view. But I try insofar as I can not to judge what a reader takes away from it. I don't think that that's my job.
Mm-hmm. So one thing too I found interesting about the book, you give a lot of advice, actual, advice that a salesperson could go out there in the world and use as a job. Why did you include that level of detail in a book that's basically a fictional book? So you think of that, maybe in a self-help book, you would get that kind of advice about, how to be a better salesperson. But you combine those kind of self-help nuggets in this fictional book.
Yeah, it goes back to the beginning where you said that there's a lot of gems that are dropped. The idea was that this wouldn't just be an engaging narrative, but would also double as a sales manual, so that anyone who picks it up would be able to gain a basic proficiency in sales. Maybe that will help them in an interview, ask for more money. Maybe it will help them in their own roles, or at the very least, it'll empower them to advocate for themselves better and for those that they love. So that was the idea. And sometimes it resonates and maybe sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, another interesting thing I read that you said that some kind of comparison to the book to the movie Get Out. I got to ask him about what did he mean by that comparison?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if I've ever mentioned Get Out, then it's relating to how Darren has fallen into the sunken place, which is the verbiage that we got from Get Out. But a lot of people compare it to Sorry to Bother You. But, I like Sorry to Bother You. That's not what this is. Sorry to Bother You is really out there, and it does contain a lot of truth that Boots Riley injected into it. But that's more so about a guy who, picked up a phone, he was doing some sales, whereas this is in some ways closer to a Wolf of Wall Street, where sales is in his DNA. It's what he eats, sleeps, and drinks,
Okay. Another concept in the book is this whole concept of diversity with fangs. Explain that for us.
Well, I mean, I think that anyone that is in business or keyed into business, especially in this day and age, hears about diversity and inclusion and can feel as though it's a buzzword, because I think for a lot of organizations it actually is. And sometimes you just get a figurehead who's black or brown, you say, we've done our job, and they haven't actually changed the environment. So this book is holding that up to the light and saying, what does diversity and inclusion actually look like in practice? And what prevents some organizations from actually achieving it or even beginning to enact those changes? And I think that some of it has to do with heart. People have to actually believe in their hearts that there's a problem in order to change it, rather than just feeling guilty and saying, we're listening, we'll do better. So this book is just highlighting some of the differences and putting the responsibility on the reader to come away with their own conclusions.
Now, I know you said when you set out to write this book, you didn't necessarily think of Jenna Bush's, book club as your ideal audience. But of course, as any author, you want anybody to buy this book. Yeah. But you said you set out to write it for Black folks. So what do you want Black folks, me, you, other Black folks, to take away from the book?
Well, and if I could generalize, right, I'd like to say that anyone who's ever been in these scenarios, where they are the only one or one of the few, to know that they're not crazy, they're not overly sensitive, and that they're not paranoid when they perceive something to be amiss. and that they, like anyone else, has the same chance and deserves the same right to chase success and in some cases achieve it.
Okay. Powerful message. Yeah. So, okay, Mateo, what's next? I think at the beginning you said you're in your parents' house working on 8 other books.
No. I was saying that I'm in my own spot. I'm saying that there's another world. If Black Buck didn't work out, I'd still be in my parents' crib just trying to get a book out.
If it didn't work out, okay.
No, I'm in Brooklyn. Okay. This is my home, but yeah, I'm working on another book. Hopefully we can get some traction and adapt this to the screen. So, maybe we'll be making some moves in that direction, connecting with, fine individuals such as yourself and anyone else who reads the book. And it drops in the UK next month. So getting ready for that. Yeah.
So, are you still at that tech firm?
Nah, I've been out of that world for a minute. Yeah, nah.
So you're a full-time writer now.
I'm a full-time writer. So when I left that job in 2016, I started to pursuing writing more seriously. I traveled a little bit, but then I needed to make money. So I started to consult with tech startups across North America, teaching them how to build and scale their sales teams. And then in 2019, when I got this book deal, that's when I stopped and have become a full-time writer.
Okay.
Knock on wood, it doesn't end anytime soon. Come on.
I know. It's hard living as a writer. So the fact that you're able to quit a job and support yourself as an author is like major.
Yeah.
And I sit here as someone that's written 3 books, so I know how incredible difficult it is to get a book deal, to get a book agent, to get a book on the shelf, to then, sell books, and then the publisher that, you should get that 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th book. So, nothing but kudos to you for what you've been able to accomplish and not giving up, when those other books didn't work out. I just want to get into a little bit about this path to freedom, emotional space, about chasing your dreams, not letting failure or disappointment stop you. That's a big part of what this book is saying. And in this moment when we are witnessing, police shootings, what's happening at the border with immigrants, there's so much to be negative about, so much to be down about. How do you, help us understand how you've been able to channel such positivity in this book and, for the projects that you're working on?
Well, it goes back to audience. Right. Because it is hard to write through these, I don't even know how to describe it, right? So like these tragedies that are daily and that are have just been so part and parcel to history, right? It's not like it's one moment. For me, I try to think about the audience that I'm writing for. I remember that no one else is going to do this work. Like in terms of writing the books that I want to write, no one's going to do it and then say, hey man, here's a finished book. Just go, put it out. No, I got to do it myself. I try to tap into my purpose, right? What I believe is my life's purpose. And some days I can't though. Some days I got to take a break, try to get into nature, try to, speak with the people who uplift me. Yeah. So that's what I do. I just try to take it day by day.
So for that person sitting in the audience who's saying they got a book inside of them, they've talked a lot about writing a book, but they haven't been able to just take that first step. Well, what would you say to someone? Mm-hmm. You meet a lot of people and they say, oh, I want to write a book. Oh, I want to write a book. But not a lot of people do it.
I say, stop talking about it, start writing. Like honestly, and I know that sounds like some pull yourself up by your bootstraps type American mentality, but you just have to begin. Beginning is sometimes the hardest part. And I write in the book, so many people never begin because they're afraid of failure, just even the thought of it. All you got to do is begin, be kind to yourself, try not to judge yourself in the act of creation, and make sure that you finish. Make sure that you finish your work. And then after that, you can edit it with your mind. You can revise as many times as you need to, but get it out there and finish it.
So you said the possibility exists that the book is going to make it to the big screen, may make it to a TV, network, or streaming site. Who's going to be Darren?
I have no idea, but I'm telling you, do you know Kelvin Harrison Jr.? I want him to play it. Yeah, Kelvin Harrison Jr., he was in a movie called Waves.
All right, producer Rashad, let's bring up Kelvin. I always want to see what Kelvin looks like.
Get Kelvin, man.
Page? No, I don't know.
Kelvin's the one. He was in Luce, Luce. He's in The Godfather of Harlem.
Wait a minute, I watched Godfather of Harlem. What role does he play?
He was playing the musician that was going out with the Italian mobster's daughter that got killed.
The guy who's that's
Teddy was his name.
Yeah,
that's Kelvin Harrison Jr.
Okay.
Yeah, I like him, or maybe Stephen James, who was in If Beale Street Could Talk. He was the main actor. Yeah, or him.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. There's Kelvin. Can he play Darren? Look at him.
All right. Why those guys? Because I was thinking, what
were you thinking?
Well, I was being tongue in cheek when I said Reggae Page, because he's like the hottest thing on the planet, right? He's around the same age, and I don't know. We'd like to see him in more television and film. But
maybe
why Kelvin for you? Why Kelvin?
The range, right? I've seen Kelvin in so many different works, and he's like, how is mispronounced this guy's name? Damson Idris. He's an English actor, right? He's in Snowfall, and they have this ability, sort of like Denzel in Training Day, where you never
bring up John David. Washington. Okay,
he's too old to play Buck, but yeah, but because he's like 22 for most of the time. But these people have that almost like. It's disturbing, where you don't know what's going on in their faces, and there's so much going on internally. And I would just love to see them in the scenario where they go from Bed-Stuy to Manhattan. And they're subjected so much to where they want to punch this white dude who's subjecting them to all this stuff. And then there's the conflict of like, no, I got to prove. I just think they could do it. Yeah.
Well, no doubt, who could best embody the character traits and, the persona of Darren, because Darren, lives in you, Darren in and out. So I'm just so excited for you, so happy for you. I know you said this isn't easy work. I know it's not easy work, but you've been able to push through, and you've been able to push through under some just horrific circumstances. As a young Black man, I know every time you turn on television and see one of these police shootings or, the trial of Derek Chauvin, that has to impact you. But it hasn't stopped your creative juices from flowing. Again, I'm just so happy that you're able to push through. Any chances of you writing about any of those experiences that we're seeing, like Dante Wright or so many young, men who are losing their life to police violence? Any chance that you step into that space?
Yes, but not directly. Like, not directly addressing these tragedies, but maybe doing it more so in a way where what I'm talking about without it. And I'm trying to be vague here. There's just so many different ways. Like, it could take place in the future. It could take place in all these different, what I'm saying? Like parallels where it's fresh and it's new, but it still has the message in there. With Black Buck in the epilogue, for anyone who reads it, and when you get there, there is a few pages dedicated to the fact that, Black and brown individuals and Black and brown men specifically populate so much of the prison system in New York politics, and how that came to be in terms of people, pushing marijuana, which everyone's cool with now, right? But all these people got locked up. So there's always going to be a political bent to my work, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Mateo, keep letting that, creativity flow out of you. So happy for you. Everybody run out to your store, go online, wherever you get your books from. Make sure you get your copy of Black Buck. This is a book that you will not put down. You will read it, once, over, and then you'll probably pick it up and read it a second time, a third time. You'll share it with your friends. You'll tell your family members about it. You'll tell your coworkers about it. And more importantly, you're going to be supporting the work of talented young Black man. And, we don't get to see, unfortunately, not enough positive images like you. And so that's why I'm super excited and happy that I had an opportunity to showcase you to my audience. So again, thank you so much for sitting down with me, and best of luck with this project and all of your future projects.
Thank you so much, Areva. Everyone who's watching, take care and be well. Peace.
All right. Thank you. My next guest is Dr. Tommy Curry. He is one of the nation's leading race scholars. His research focuses on the Black male experience. He's also an award-winning author of multiple books, including The Man, Not Race: Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. And he's also the author of Another White Man's Burden. Welcome, Dr. Curry, and thank you so much for joining me this morning. I want to talk about your book, Black Man Not: Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. I know the book came out in 2017. It won an American Book Award in 2018, but I thought it was still so relevant today because, particularly in the U.S., with the recent high-profile shootings of George Floyd, Daunte Wright, Andrew Brown, just this whole slew of Black men who've been killed by police. I thought the content and the subject matter of your book, was even more relevant today. Let's talk a little about, some of the controversy. Some folks had some pretty critical things to say about this book. Others, like the American Book Award, said it was a brilliant piece of scholarship. Help us understand why, the book caused so much controversy, and particularly in certain academic circles.
Well, as you know, the Man Not tries to build a theory that explains the vulnerability that Black men have to violence. And that's not just physical violence like police killing, but also sexual violence. And a lot of the empirical findings, the research that we've done, the interviews that we've done, the data sets that we've mined, really does show that many of the ideas of feminism and Black feminism intersectionality just doesn't hold up when brought under empirical scrutiny. So a lot of the criticism is that the book really does push back on the idea that Black men have privilege, that Black men are somehow safer in society than their female counterparts because they're men. And of course, it really does make a case for why we need a unique field to study Black men, which I call Black male studies, specifically so we could get under some of these issues that you're mentioning, like why police are disproportionately killing Black men compared to their Black female counterpart. And of course, mass incarceration, which disproportionately targets Black men and boys.
Yeah, so the whole Black feminist pushback that the book received, I feel like I need to invite some of my Black feminist scholars on to have that debate. So I'm going to put that debate aside because I'm going to reserve that for some of my feminist scholars who are deeply entrenched, in that work, because I don't feel like I can do it justice. But what I can do justice is a conversation about, and what really, drew me to the book was this concept that you wanted to change the narrative about Black male masculinity and how it's often compared, I guess, or your notion, or I guess one of the premises of the book is that it's unfair to look at Black male masculinity in the same way that we think about white male masculinity. Help us understand that discussion point in the book.
Well, a lot of the studies looking at how Black men actually understand male manhood shows that Black men don't share the same kind of values that white men share. That they're much more egalitarian, they're much more social, much more interdependent. So this is actually work that's done by Black feminists and Black women, like Evelyn Simeon or Wisdom Powell. These theories really do undergird how people like Robert Staples and Black men have long talked about the importance of family and justice. Why you have people like Martin Luther King, pushing for peaceful revolution, or even how you have revolutionaries like the Black Panther Party or Frantz Fanon. In Black manhood, there is a sense of justice and equality, a notion of freedom that I think translates throughout Black communities that often gets overlooked. Far too often, we talk about Black men as deviants, as failed fathers, despite evidence showing that Black men are the most involved fathers, despite being incarcerated or not. These positive notions, these notions that show that Black men are resilient, that they develop positive responses to racism and societal marginalization, those don't get highlighted throughout the academy, and certainly not within the media cycles that we see throughout the United States. So the book is really trying to show that there's a kind of caricature going on around Black men, where we look at theory, we look at stereotypes, we look at the fear that other Americans have of Black men and boys as the basis of interpreting them, rather than looking at the evidence, which is based in interviews with Black men, looking at how they actually live their lives, which shows that they're much more vibrant and humane and just than any other group in the United States.
Yeah, and when I was doing a lot of research on the book, and I know it's broken down into different parts. And one of the first, first chapters, I guess, you talk about the enslaving and controlling of Black men. Why was it important to go back and do that kind of historical, deep dive and to really help people frame the whole concept of slavery and the relationship between Black men as slaves and their white, male owners?
Well, I think there's a lot of things in slavery that go overlooked with Black males, right? One of the most important things I highlight is not only that Black men were victims of rape and sexual violence during slavery, sodomization, etc., but also that Black men were heavily caricaturized, that they were stereotyped by white feminists and suffragettes. So what I wanted to do is retrieve that history. I think that we have a notion that we got the right to vote because Black men fought in the Civil War, and white women were somehow upset about that because they thought it was unfair. But we don't tell the story of how white women aligned themselves with the Democratic Party, how they've held extremely negative views that Black men were savages and that they were more violent than even white slave owners. These histories are very important. So in the book, I give that kind of analysis, and I show that Black men were actually the targets of lots of white feminist activism during that period of time. People like Rebecca Latimer Felton, she wanted to actually institute mass lynchings of Black men because she thought that Black men were rapists. Charlotte Gilman, who thought that Black men were expendable and that this was the natural progress of women's liberation to eliminate, lesser men so that white women could thrive and have liberation. These are all very rich parts of our history that complicate our narrative of civil rights and how Black men were actually given the right to vote and the kind of obstacles they faced in doing so.
Help us understand. So based on your historical analysis, you're saying that white women during this period, we're talking about, period of slavery and period right after slavery, Reconstruction period, white women saw Black men as their enemy because they saw them as an impediment to the freedoms and liberation that they were seeking?
Absolutely. So there's lots of actual periodicals and writings that you get from people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Phoebe Cousins that actually make that exact argument that if you empower Black men through the ballot, that they would actually try to ruin white womanhood and impede the right of women to actually get the right to vote. The idea was that Black men, because they were savages, could never respect women as equals. So even though Black men overwhelmingly supported the right of women to vote, be they Black or white, during this period of time, the idea was to depict them as if they were, anti-suffrage. What that did is it created caricatures that existed were perpetuated well into the 20th century to suggest that Black men are sexist, misogynistic, and actually want to dominate women. These notions that we get or that we think start in the mid-20th century actually have roots deep within the literature and the journalism of white suffragettes, in the 1800s.
And do you see that carried out? Like how are those notions that historical notion that you talked about in terms of white women's view of Black men and this, as the boogeyman, I think is somehow a phrase that's often used. How is that carried over into what we see today in terms of the dynamics between white women and Black men?
Oh God, it's so insidious. If you're looking even in the 1970s, you see that white women, on the back of second wave feminism, were actually building their theories of gender inequality and notions of rape and violence from racist white criminologists. So you had people like Susan Brown Miller, the authors of The Second Assault, Holmes and Williams, actually drawing from racist subculture violence theories, which believed that poor Black men were more prone to violence, rape, deviance against women, etc., and that they've actually distorted white patriarchy, that white patriarchy was something that, of course, was sexist and bad, but it was really the brutality of Black men that really endangered white women in American society. These kinds of theories developed into what we understand in the 90s as a super predator mythology, and of course, all the deficit models that we see today. The idea of Black men as being naturally prone to rape and violence and crime really does have an interesting history that's surrounded by these debates of feminists and criminologists in the 60s and 70s around the fundamental notion of Black masculinity and the role that gender plays in American society.
So, Professor Curry, you and some of the reviews, really preeminent scholars who talk about your book in terms of its brilliance, who are really, huge supporters of your work and talk about how methodical, the book is, research and how you use, data to support these theories. If this data is out there, if it's available to, your peers in academia, why isn't this being exposed more broadly by more scholars, particularly in this era where we're having this debate about critical race theory. So, I would imagine that, from an academic standpoint, this is part of the study of critical race theory. So why aren't we hearing more about these, this dynamic between white women and black men, the caricature of black men, the whole history of how black men have been painted? Why aren't we hearing more from your scholars? Of your scholarly peers?
In the academy. Right. Well, in the academy, academic work is driven as much by ideology as it is by research. So research that contradicts ideology is often, with its own time, extremely non-popular. And this is just a general trend. So these findings are inevitably going to be proven. It's just that you don't have very many scholars that are looking at the histories or the racism of feminism or even the histories of sexual violence and rape in the United States. Louise Newman wrote a book back in 1999 on the racist origins of white women's rights. And that book is a staple in anybody who's working in this kind of historiography, but she doesn't receive a lot of praise for it. It's not like you're going to go to a conference and people start this conversation, because it's extremely unpopular given the moment that we're in right now with Me Too, the rise of feminism, women's rights, etc. But one of the jobs of a scholar, especially a critical race theorist, is to actually look at the data and the evidence before them. It's not a popular opinion to hold that America is permanently racist, but we keep seeing evidence that actually may be the case. So the unpopular opinion is not always the most welcomed opinion. And I think there's a lot of pressure in the academy to appear progressive, to appear liberal, because most of the people that are allies of black people in the academy are liberal whites. And the research that I do steps on their toes. It really does show that at every way that you turn, every theory, be it a liberal theory, a progressive theory, even feminism itself, suffragism, criminology, sociology, etc., had at its base the black male as a social problem. And when you look at the overwhelming evidence that you can see through the data sets, be it incarceration, be it sexual victimization, domestic abuse, etc., you find over and over again that it's black men who are usually paying the toll for any kind of social mobilization, mobility, or political program in the United States over the last 150 years.
Yeah, you just said something. You said it's not popular, obviously, to talk about America as being, permanently racist. What do you think of Senator Scott from South Carolina, who recently made the statement in his rebuttal to President Biden's address to Congress, when he made the statement that America's not racist? And he made the statement as he recounted his own experiences of being racially profiled, in stores, followed by clerks in stores, and talked about the racism that he has himself personally experienced, but yet he made this bold declaration that America is not racist. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, evidently it's clearly wrong, but this is the difference between how we read racism as an individual and personal act of bias and discrimination, right, of prejudice, and how we look at institutional racism. Right, if you're going to say America's not racist, what you mean is America's not structurally. There's not something endemic to America itself that is racist. I think that's an incorrect statement, and so you switch the burden. You want to recount your personal experiences of bias and say, well, those are racist individuals. America has racists in America, but America itself is not racist. And I think the problem with that is, well, sure, but how is it that these racist individuals keep being socialized into racism? How is it that individuals keep seeming to find and repeat the same patterns of historical racial inequality and violence? And furthermore, why does America tend to keep being run both economically, politically, and socially by people that hold these kinds of antipathies towards black people and other racialized groups? When we talk about America being racist, that's what we mean, that there's something in the structure of the country that elevates this kind of thought, this kind of ideology, and rewards groups of individuals, predominantly white, who buy in and want to propagate that into the future.
Yeah, one of the things you talk about in the book is how black men and boys are decentered, and as if what happens to them, they are deserving of it. And you say black men are, constantly living in fear of being accused of some offense against them. Do you think? And you wrote the book again in 2017. Here we are.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I say yes.
In 2021, do you still believe that? You think that still holds true, that black men live in constant fear?
Absolutely. When we look at the data of black men's attitudes about this political moment, we certainly see fear and anxiety. We see all kinds of allostatic track, markers about depression and, a sense of hopelessness about the future, a sense that there hasn't been any real progress over the last few decades. And that's because black men are disproportionately burdened with things like lethal interventions from police, incarceration, downward mobility economically, as the problems that we have in education. That's not to say, of course, they're not successful black men. I never want anyone to read the book suggesting that all black men are somehow burdened by these institutional obstacles, these structural and cultural obstacles in the United States. But it is to say that there's a tremendous amount of resilience and respect that is afforded to black men who surpass and overcome these obstacles. But when we're looking at population level, group-based analysis, what's happening to black men and boys as a group, it seems undeniable that there's a dynamic that affects that group more negatively than other racial groups, and in some respects their female counterpart. And what my book tries to show is that when you look at the data, like the CDC data on domestic violence or the CDC data on rape, there's no way to escape that in certain kinds of prevalence, 12-month prevalence, black men report rates of sexual coercion and contact sexual violence that's equal to or surpassing most female groups in the United States. So the question is why? What is it about understanding this group that we just refuse to see? And what the book tries to do is really just expose and show through evidence-based reasoning that black men and boys are vulnerable, right? That it's not an oppression level, it's that they're vulnerable to certain kinds of violence that we never imagined certain kinds of men could actually be vulnerable to. And that's so extremely important in terms of how we try to solve and engage problems for this group in the future.
Yeah, you coined this term. Is it black misandry? Is that the term?
Yes, anti-black misandry.
Misandry.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And it help us understand what that means. Misandry, black misandry, anti-black misandry.
Well, misandry is, of course, the hate or strong dislike of men. Anti-black misandry is a concept or a term that I developed to show how many of the racist actions and behaviors that we see in America and throughout Western societies are peculiarly geared towards black men. So when you look at any kind of racial stereotype, overwhelmingly whites in America view negative racial stereotypes in terms of the stereotypes they have about racialized men. So if you have a view that blacks are violent, usually what's driving that stereotype is that black men are violent. You have the idea that blacks are promiscuous. Overwhelmingly, what's going to be driving that stereotype is that you think black men are hypersexual and promiscuous. So there's a misandric characterization in the stereotypes we use to generalize the whole racial populations.
And again, I'll ask you, I read an article. I know that you recently relocated. You left the United States to go teach in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh, right? You're there now teaching critical race theory and doing some of the, working in that university. I want to talk to you about something I read. It said that when you were going to Scotland, your thought was that there was a greater interest in that country in understanding these dynamics about the history of black men than you thought was prevalent in the United States. But then I read a recent article where you said your experiences in Scotland have been the same, that you have experienced the same level of racial hatred and vitriol in Scotland. Any doubt, any regrets about that transition from Texas, where you were teaching at Texas A&M to University of Edinburgh?
Not really. The caveat there is that the white people here don't have guns. They just write strongly worded emails. So the violence is one of the major differences between the two societies. But in response, the article that where I recently made that comment was in response to the idea that there was no racism in Scotland. Here, there's the idea that it's a colorblind and ultimately just and equal society. And what I was trying to explain to the interviewer was that when you look at how white people in the UK think about race, it's very similar to how they think about race in the United States. The only difference is that because the racial populations here are not as high, there's less black people, there's less brown people, etc. There's not a need to manage racial populations through violence. So there's certainly not a regret, but I want it to be very clear that there is a intellectual interest in the study of race in many of the ancient universities, but that is not undergirded by socially progressive views. Black people will still experience anti-Black racism in Scotland and Britain the same way that we experience in the United States. The biggest difference is in the United States, the idea of killing Black people, of taking away their livelihoods, threatening their lives, threatening their family for doing intellectual work that runs contrary to what the white majority thinks, is still alive and well. My academic freedom has been overwhelmingly supported and undoubtedly protected in the UK, where it wasn't in the United States.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the things that you experienced before you left Texas A&M. This whole controversy around this interview you gave in 2012 that got misconstrued as you somehow suggesting that there should be violence against white folks, and causing the university president, the Texas A&M president, to make some comments that he was disheartened by that. Help us understand what was happening, because when I look at that whole controversy, thinking back to 2017, Donald Trump is president.
Absolutely.
The country is experiencing something the likes of which it had never experienced before. Do you think that had that incident happened today, because I can't help but think that we're in this moment where someone like you, who's talking about these, critical race theories and the issue of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, that maybe your comments would have been received differently. Do you think that the moment had something to do with what happened to you?
It absolutely did. You have to remember that when this interview was discovered, it was already 5 years old, right? So I said, the Phil Django came out, there was the Saturday Night Live skit that Jamie Foxx gave. There was some conservative backlash. So, at the time I was doing, 5-minute segments on Sirius XM. And I clarified that, look, really when we look at Django, we don't need to romanticize this as some kind of fantasy. We need to talk seriously about revolution and armed self-defense, which are rich traditions in the history of Black civil rights. So a white supremacist blogger decided to take a statement out of context. They released transcript after transcript that clearly shows that I wasn't threatening anyone with violence, because I was actually talking about self-defense. So when you look at that moment, it's this kind of sensitivity and this racist construction, specifically of a Black man, that's saying that Black people have a right to defend themselves. And I stand by that. I believe that Black people have a constitutional right to the Second Amendment. And if you could have white vigilantes killing Black people in the streets because they think they're deputized police, certainly Black people have a right to defend themselves instead of being slaughtered. That seems to be a human instinct, a liberal and democratic principle that the country itself was founded upon. So what I was questioning is, well, why is this denied to Black people? Why is it that the minute that Black people say they have a right to protect their lives and their families, we're met with the kinds of reactions that I received for even mentioning this in the first place? So no, I don't think that if I said this, if the same thing was popular today, or I said the comment today, that would be taken up in any significant way, because I think it's just obviously true. But what I find interesting about that moment is that when Donald Trump was in office, even public universities, Research One universities, felt a draw to the ideology of conservatism and racism that denied constitutional rights to other Black citizens in the United States in the 21st century. And that is a profound realization.
Is it your understanding or your belief that those same universities had acted differently prior to Trump coming into office? So this was a new phenomenon?
Absolutely.
Okay. And you
absolutely. Absolutely.
So help us understand that. Were they drawn to Trump because that's who they naturally were? Now they got to be free and kind of, take off the costumes, or, was there some financial benefit associated with them, aligning themselves with him and his principles?
Well, I think in Texas, the latter is certainly the case. I mean, Texas is extremely conservative. A&M is a conservative university. I think there's a large board of trustees. There are trustees and alumni who support conservative agendas. And, that's where a lot of the pressure came from. As an academic argument, as I said, the argument was made 5 years beforehand. It was played on Sirius XM and put up on YouTube, and it received nothing but positive comments. So it wasn't until it was framed in a certain way by the American Conservative blog site that it really gained steam as being tracked on and targeted by white supremacists. And again, the context is important. Remember, when Trump was in office, there were lots of Black and brown scholars, both male and female, who were being attacked by white supremacists for their stances on American racism. I was just one of the first.
And I know you say that identifying, white supremacy and the violence of white supremacists, in your opinion, has now become equated to anti-whiteness. And there's this sense that if you are a scholar, just calling out, the factual history of the U.S., that you somehow are anti-white. Do you think, again, in this moment where we're having this racial reckoning in the U.S., do you still think it's as unpopular, as uncomfortable for academics, particularly, to call out white supremacy?
I mean, I think it's certainly loosened up since Trump, but I mean, they just banned critical race theory, I think, in Idaho, if I read the article correctly.
We just did a whole show on that. You're right, they did. And about 8 to 12 states are looking at similar bills to do the same.
Exactly. Nobody wanted to listen to me a few years ago, but I said that one of the reasons that Trump was so dangerous is not because of his political rhetoric, but it's because he actually empowered people to shift the intellectual spectrum on American universities and campuses. And what I mean by that is that white supremacism, the idea of being proud to be white or conserving whiteness, now becomes a legitimate political and intellectual tradition, whereas in the Obama years, it wasn't so as much. So the rise of paleoconservatism and this rise of, alt-rightism that's lurking behind these more conservative policies and ideas now create a platform for people to actually pursue this within doctoral and undergraduate research. This is a pushback against critical race theory. And notice the way they're pushing back against critical race theory and the kinds of work that I'm doing is through censorship, right? These are not the debate of ideas. This is not a free marketplace of ideas. The argument is certain ideas should not be entertained. They should be banned and not heard. So this is a very, very dangerous precedent for people who are not only doing the popular anti-racist work, but actually trying to do true revolutionary work that's trying to move the needle on the ideological and paradigmatic perspectives of how we actually view American racism. I think that in the future, it makes it possible for people to not only censor more Black and brown scholars, but it actually is going to make it harder for universities to actually protect and endorse freedom of speech and academic freedom, which is a necessity in doing this kind of research in the first place.
Yeah, and what do you think, again, a lot of folks outside of academic circles are not sitting around talking about critical race theory. If you ask the man on the street what critical race theory is, they're not likely to know. And folks aren't probably familiar even with this whole debate that's happening, inside academia, academic circles. But clearly people understand, everyday people understand that, there is a climate where, like you said, using certain words and talking about certain concepts can cause you to be the subject of, attacks, threats, threats of violence. Where do you think we go in a country if we can't talk about the factual history of slavery, if we can't talk about the factual history of racism in this country? Where do we go?
Back to the dark ages. I mean, what are the principles? It's funny. People hate the pessimism of critical race theory because Derek Bell, who I wrote my dissertation on and befriended before he passed. I'm a Harvard Law School graduate, so I was an intern of Derek Bell. I love everything Derek Bell. Actually, my maiden name is Bell, so he's a mentor. That's fantastic.
Was a mentor, and so I love him dearly.
Well, he was,
brilliant.
Derek is brilliant. When I got my first job at A&M, he sent me a long email because I was doing my dissertation on his work, and he was telling me, he's like, people thought you wouldn't get a job because of your pessimism and following my work, but this is proof that there's a career here. So, Derek was always encouraging of trying to develop and push, why we see this constant retreat back into racism, right? And I think Trump is just one example of that. But it's interesting that people will constantly say that Derek's wrong, but they have no explanation for the overall embrace and popularity of Trump's platform. They say that Derek's wrong and that democracy is based on freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of association and all these great liberal principles. But then when you see people banning speech, no one's outraged, right? The white liberals who have these deep sensibilities of democracy.
They're banning. See, that's it. It's not the blanket banning of speech, but it's this particular speech that is being targeted.
Right. But any speech, right? It should be a threat to all speech, right?
No, of course. I mean, I believe, the First Amendment has to apply equally to all kinds of speech, but the speech around these concepts of race. And it's so funny because we had a woman on the show who, she does diversity and inclusion with corporations. And she said after the George Floyd, execution, the murder that we witnessed with our very eyes, there was this moment where corporations were calling her in. She was just overwhelmed with folks who wanted her to come in and do diversity and inclusion training training and, help them become racist and help them understand what it meant to be anti-Black. And she said, now there's this retreat that's happening. And some of the language that they were fully embracing, back in the summer, May, June of last year, that now they're like, maybe that language is too strong. Maybe that's, too negative. Maybe that's too harsh. So she's seeing this retreat. And what I always say on this show is race is so complicated. And it makes people so uncomfortable. And when you have these uncomfortable conversations, I feel like as a country, we get right up to the line of maybe being ready to have a breakthrough. And it gets so uncomfortable that, we retreat and we run back to our respective corners. And I feel like, in that moment now, I thought, making some tremendous progress after, what we witnessed in May, June, the summer of last year. But now people are kind of settling in that, that's hard stuff. We don't want to talk about that stuff. So not only are we not going to talk about it, we're going to ban schools from even teaching kids so that future generations won't even know about it to be able to talk about it. So that's a little discouraging.
But this is the role of censorship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But we got to end this interview on something positive. So help us understand, because I think that folks who are afraid of critical race theory, oftentimes they don't even understand it. They hear Black, they hear the word race, and they just get, freaked out for no reason. So help us understand critical race theory and why it's powerful and can be, that vehicle through which we start to achieve some of the very things that we say we stand for in this country.
Well, I mean, I think that if I'm following Derek seriously in critical race theory, it's the power of resilience, and it's the power of Black Americans to have a imagination of what democracy could actually be. When he offered Afro-Atlantica as an analogy, as a utopia, so to speak, of why Black people could breathe and actually live on that island, he's suggesting to us that the most powerful ideas of freedom and liberty and democracy don't come from the systems that we know are already ruined, that's oppressing people and have, blood through the centuries on its ideas, but it comes from the people who are able to see a new reality, a new future, and move that forward. He just doesn't think that that's going to happen on this land, on this geography. And I think that being inspired by critical race theory and Derek's work and vision is why I developed Black Male Studies, because we have a very serious problem with the elimination and death, the disposability of Black men and boys in this country that we have not yet been able to confront. And I think that through encountering why Black men are just expected to die, why we assume it to be normal, why I assume them to be removed from society and incarcerated, tells us something about ourselves, tells us something about the way democracy works, and puts a really crude reflection and mirror to our faces about why we endorse some theories over others and refuse data in the lives and humanity of Black men and boys.
All right, Professor Curry, what's next for you? You coming back to the States anytime soon to start, some of those departments at a U.S. university to teach, Black male studies?
I think that I'm certainly open to it. I'm loving it here in Europe. I think that Europe has a really fascinating appreciation of the Black male experience here that I find refreshing. Despite identities of debates about identity and who's the most oppressed that I get in the U.S. But yeah, I mean, I'm open to coming back to the U.S. The U.S. is my home. Louisiana is where I'm from. I'm Southern at heart. So yeah, I'm certainly more than open to U.S. universities who are serious in dealing with the problems of killing our people and the downward mobility of Black men and boys. If that's a serious endeavor, I'm certainly willing to come back and start that up.
Are you missing? I got to ask you this: are you missing the food in Louisiana? When I think
absolutely
of Southern food, soul food, Cajun food,
My goodness!
Can Europe get down like that? That's what we got to ask you.
Europe can't get down like that. Europe can't get down. You know what I would give for a catfish fillet? I mean, just some fried catfish. It's. I joke with my wife all the time. I was like, the UK went and colonized India, but they clearly didn't bring how to use any of the spices. These people can't season food to save their life. But no, I do miss home. I miss some gumbo. And I think being from the South, it gives you a different perspective, a different appreciation for the food, but the people too. You appreciate the struggles of Black people that are expressing culture and resistance through their food, their cuisine, their song. And, that's what I was raised on. So, I get a little homesick every now and then.
Yeah, I have to imagine. So yes, there's nothing like Southern hospitality, and definitely nothing like Southern food.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Professor Curry. Enjoyed sitting down talking with you. Your work is revolutionary. American Book Award, and like I said, so many scholars, nothing but praise. And nothing wrong with a little controversy, because we got to get uncomfortable to get comfortable.
Absolutely not.
So keep doing what you're doing. Keep raising your voice. Keep being an advocate. Keep making us uncomfortable by telling the truth. That's we talk about freedom of speech. That's what it is, right? And
yes,
you're doing it at its finest level. And maybe, hopefully, not too distant future, you'll be back on this side of the continent sharing your brilliance with those of us in the U.S. So again, thank you for sitting down with me.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Mateo and to Dr. Curry for joining me this morning. And thanks to all of you for joining me. This has been a fascinating show. These two authors are amazing. They both have written very different books, but both have a lot in common. These are incredibly difficult subjects. So I'm grateful to anyone bold enough to challenge the status quo. And we don't always have to agree. But now more than ever, this moment calls on all of us to re-examine the whitewashed history and framing of African American men and women. And these two authors are doing just that. Some words to live by before I get out. In the famous words of Biggie Small, and if you don't know, now you know. Both of my guests today have written books that are sure to upset and challenge those who are invested in static theories about race. Books like these make it impossible for the reader to remain ambivalent about the history and impact of racism on Black men and women. What you do with this knowledge, that's up to you. But with books like these and others by authors such as James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and more, you can never say you don't know. In fact, now you do know. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask. And don't forget, we are all in this together.